Hi, and welcome to the District Architecture Center and our third episode of the Giants of Washington Architecture. This is a series about architects who have really influenced Washington, and we use the word giants because there's a quote by Isaac Newton that says, "I have seen further because I'm standing on the shoulders of giants." And I want to introduce you to one of our giants, Amy Weinstein. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Great. So, Amy, your father was an architect and president of this chapter and very involved in Washington architecture. So I wonder, did you choose architecture as a profession, or did architecture choose you?
Oh, that's a good question. Growing up with my father being an architect, I think I was exposed to architecture more than someone who didn't. We lived in a mid-century modern house that my father designed in 1951. When the family would travel, we would see Frank Lloyd Wright buildings or whatever. But I really never thought about becoming an architect until one day in high school. I was walking down the corridor and I looked in a classroom. It was a drafting class and it was all boys. And I thought, that might be an interesting class to take. So I took it the next semester and actually, learned to draft, discovered I liked it. At which point it occurred to me, gee, architects do this, and maybe this is what I want to do.
Your son Jacob is also an architect?
Yes, he is. It's so fascinating to watch, your own child grow up and become an architect.
And your husband is no slouch in the architecture department,
That's right.
Phil Esikoff.
He's also an architect.
Yeah, so it's quite the family business.
Yes.
Talk to me about, you use brick, which is a classic Washington material, but you use it in such a different way with a lot of color. What inspired you to do that?
Well, my first job when I graduated from architecture school at Penn was with the office of Venturi, Rauch, and Scott Brown. It later became Venturi, Scott Brown. At that time, Bob Venturi was experimenting with brick. They were doing a lot of lab buildings on campuses up and down the East Coast, which were ribbon windows with then continuous spandrels. And he started to look at brick as a way to bring a reference to the past into very modern buildings. Strip windows, long spandrels was very modern, but using a Flemish bond brick pattern and allowing it to be seen by the coloration of the bricks was new. And so I actually trained on my construction documents on buildings like that. So I learned how to do it. Mm-hmm. And then when I came to Washington and started to work on, for example, Capitol Hill, which is essentially a brick historic district, it seemed an appropriate medium. And I still love to use brick because it's still laid by hand, usually. And you really get the sense of a human being, a mason, building the building you live or work in, bit by bit, placing one on top of the other. It's a lot different than thinking about the sealant installer who is squeezing sealant out of a tube between two pieces of metal.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about Bob Venturi. Many think of him as the father of postmodernism, and postmodernism gets such a bad rap these days. What was it like working with him, and what was the feeling, I guess, when it was postmodernism was, I guess, sort of a response to the international style and all details stripped away? Right.
Bob hated the term postmodernism, but I think it has value in that it simply means after modernism.
Right.
Basically, it really all started with Bob's book, Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture, which I think was published in 1961. Where he advocated for a both and instead of an either or, which was modernism. Both and was both, you can be both modern and of your time, and you can also, though, be part of the continuum of architectural history and humanism that started back several thousand years ago.
Well, that's really interesting because there's this constant sort of tension here in Washington that you're either classic or you're modern, and you can't really be both. Are you looking to do both in your buildings?
Yes. I've always tried to be both modern and refer back to history, except for one project, the Hope 6 project on Capitol Hill, which was a public housing. And back then, in the late 80s, public housing architecture had a horrible reputation, and it looked horrible. My clients really felt that the buildings, the houses, should not look modern. My goal was to destigmatize this site, which is right in the heart of historic Capitol Hill, We were tearing down the flat roof modern buildings, and it had been abandoned in 1987 as public housing by the city, and it was festering and
Right.
an eyesore. And the project started where residents of the Capitol Hill community came to me and asked me if I would do some pro bono sketches of what could be done with the Ellen Wilson site that they could then take to the Housing Authority and see if they could get some movement.
Right. And the Housing Authority was like, go away, we're not interested.
Right, we can't do anything. But I do remember standing on the street with the community people around me, and we were looking at the abandoned public housing, and someone said, well, can't you just put like peaked roofs on it? And I thought, that's going to look just as strange here as,
Right.
And then I thought, well, why is it that we stigmatize public housing to not look like the rest of the community
Right.
that it's built in? And I think there probably were political reasons for that way back when. But I said, why can't we just tear this down and build what looks like Capitol Hill so you can't see the boundary between
Right.
this project and the rest? And that became the mantra for the whole project. There was a DC surplus school site, about 3.5 acres, right there across from the Eastern Market. The school had been closed for a few years, and the city's Deputy Mayor for Economic Development put out a request for proposals from developers to develop it. And the team that I was on with Stanton and East Bank won the project. And in total, it's about 600,000 square feet,
Yeah, it's a huge
including
project.
what's underground, which is especially huge for the Capitol Hill Historic
Right,
District.
right.
And it consists of 4 different buildings, plus a below-grade garage. It has about 60,000 square feet of retail at grade, all on all the street edges, except for the residential street, 8th Street. There's an office building right at the corner of 7th and Penn.
It has that interesting sort of, it's not wavy brick, it's kind of, it's got a lot of angles to it. It's really interesting.
So we were looking at, like we like to do, we were looking at Victorian brick office buildings, warehouses. Victorian because it's in the heart of the Victorian Capitol Hill
Right.
community. And one of the great things about brick is the corbelling of brick, where each successive course up nudges out just a little bit. And there's so much wonderful ornament on townhouses all around the city,
Right.
with that kind of panel brick construction. And the Victorian office buildings or warehouses, whatever of the time, were usually brick piers, huge brick piers, sometimes double stories with infill for the 2 stories, as big kind of proud structures, and always with vertical attenuated proportions and things like that. So we thought, all right, office building, vertically attenuated proportions, brick piers. And then we thought about the corbelling. And so what those piers do is that there is nothing that is tilted. No brick is tilted. They're all perfectly vertical. But what happens is that it starts off as a rectangle in one orientation, say parallel to the street. And in each successive course, one side of the pier corbels in, while another 90-degree angle corbels out. And so by the time, if it starts off as a rectangle like this in plan at the bottom, it has done this at the top.
It's
and
it's very modern. I mean,
Yes.
it's very, and there it is here's this really interesting new sort of way to use brick, but it's actually a really old way to use brick.
Exactly.
How interesting.
And that's what grounds it in the historic district. Very modern, but it's grounded.
Yeah, and then around the side there are lower buildings is there residential in there as well?
Yes, there are 3 different residential buildings. There's one very long building all along 8th Street, which is totally residential. And it was conceived of as a terrace of housing, like the Bath terraces. And there was a local developer in Victorian times, Schneider was his name, and he was a developer and an architect. And he did huge numbers of townhouses all at once. They all looked like they were designed by the same hand, but there was a lot of variety.
Right.
He had a palette of materials and he used them in different ways. And so since we were designing an apartment building with one entrance, but we were right across from historic townhouses, we conceived of it as a terrace of housing so that it's broken down, and you can tell it's all designed at one time, built at one time, but it has the cadence of more like a townhouse at the street edge. And then there's an apartment building on 7th Street that's catty-corner from the Eastern Market itself. And that building is straight up. but we took the front wall of it along C Street, and we reopened C Street through the site. It had been closed, but tilted it back away from the corner of the Eastern Market to create a public plaza for the great gatherings that happen every weekend at Eastern Market.
It's a very busy spot. We talked about your dad and Bob Venturi being your influences. Who else was influencing your career?
Well, there were many women who together influenced my career. When I was growing up in my father's office, Burla and Abel, which later became Burla, Abel, and Weinstein, there was always at least one woman architect working in that firm, which was very unusual.
Yeah.
And so I grew up not realizing that how few women architects there were at the time. And then there was Clothiel Smith in town, extremely successful woman architect who had her own firm. And she and my father had been draftsmen together in Burla and Abel in the early days. So she was a family friend too. And then when I went to architecture school, right on the cusp of women going in greater numbers. And we had several women professors. So I really didn't think much about being a woman architect. There were these role models, in my life. And then when I went to work for Bob Venturi, I was also working for Janice Scott Brown, who's an extraordinary planner and architect in her own right. And just, it just seemed like there was no problem being a woman architect.
So what kind of lasting impact do you want to have on the city? What do you want to see for the city? What do you most want to have happen here in DC?
I once asked my father if his father could come back from the dead, what would he show him in Washington? And he said, I would take him to K Street, because when my father was a youth, K Street was Victorian mansions from DuPont Circle area west. And of course, in my father's architectural lifetime, that was all torn down and the K Street office buildings were built. And my father has passed away close to 10 years now, and I've thought that if I could have him back for one day, what would I show him about his beloved city? And I would take him to Massachusetts Avenue and north of that into Noma and that whole area, because the L'Enfant plan was really just on paper and curbs for his whole lifetime, and now it's built out where the streets are spaces defined by buildings on both sides, and it's just remarkable and really gives you such great confidence in the value of a good plan.
Right. Talk to me a little bit about Victorian architecture and why these details appeal to you. I think it's a little more than just you're working on Capitol Hill.
Right. Well, I do love Victorian architecture. I love all styles of architecture, including modernism and neo-modernism, and to me they are styles. They're not truths. They're styles.
Yeah.
What I love is figuring out what was going on in the architect's head as he or she, probably he, far in the past, was creating what I see. What were they thinking about? What was influencing them? I love that it's a way, I'm a very active learner, a way to learn about what each was going on with each style. John Ruskin wrote The Stones of Venice, I think 1871, something like that, where he wrote about Venice architecture, and he was a super exuberant writer, and he wrote about the medieval, the Gothic, and he wrote about the Palladian churches, the Renaissance, and he didn't like Renaissance. It was stripped down, boring to him. He loved the Gothic. That was a very instrumental book in the history of architecture in both England and then later in America. And so in England, architects read that book. Some of them, and Pugin was their leader, said, oh, he talks about Gothic architecture, it's so inspirational. We should build everything in the Gothic style. And then there were the latitudinous who said, oh, he likes Gothic, but he also likes this, and he wrote so wonderfully, and we're so enthralled about all these different periods. We can do them all. And in Washington, and interesting, eventually this comes to America.
Right.
In Washington on the Mall, the castle, Smithsonian Castle, is a Puginist Victorian building, very Gothic looking. And next to it is the Arts and Industries, a latitudinal building.
Oh, how interesting.
Which doesn't look Gothic, but it borrows from a lot of different styles. And so that eclecticism of the latitudinous really appeals to me because it's the modern and the old. and this style and this style. It's the both and that Bob Venturi wrote about in 1961 that makes life so interesting, that we're not one-dimensional people. We have so many different aspects to ourselves, and buildings that are truly engaging are layered up with all types of meanings and symbols and styles, and how they're executed is what it's all about.
Thank you so much for joining me today, Amy.
Well, this has been a real pleasure, and I feel so honored to be asked to be part of this AIA dialogue.
And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on the Giants of Washington Architecture.